This video will go over how to complete the vertebrate classification activity. Directions. Number 1. Go through the Vertebrate Examples PDF. So in the Google Classrooms, you may have noticed that there is a PDF labeled Vertebrate Examples. It'll look something like this. It's a long list of different vertebrates, alligator, cardinals, the raucous toad, and several others. So you can go through those and you can read the characteristics of the animal, and you're trying to figure out which of the 5 categories of vertebrates does it fall into. Step 2 says use your notes to help classify the animals into one of 5 groups of vertebrates. Now again, it is extremely important that you have notes on the 5 groups of vertebrates somewhere on paper, in a notebook, or on the Google Doc that we shared. But make sure that you have a consistent place to go back to check these groups. Step 3, write the name of each animal in the correct section in the data table. So that's the data table right below. And then step 4 is once you've organized all the animals, go ahead and answer the questions underneath. So let's do one together. I'm going to go up to the top. Starting with the alligator. Okay, it is cold-blooded, covered in scales, has 4 legs and 1 tail, so those are the appendages. It can walk or swim. Babies hatch from eggs laid on land. All right, that's going to be important because we noticed that there's a difference between vertebrates that lay eggs on land versus the water. Breathes air through lungs, again important, so it's not gills. And it lives in and around fresh water. I don't know if that one's particularly important, interesting, not important. If I need to, I can go back to the slides if my notes aren't finished. Ideally, you'd be going to your notes and you could pretty quickly identify which one it is. So again, I'm going to be comparing the characteristics of an alligator to the characteristics of these 5 groups. All right, so looking at amphibians. Amphibians are covered in smooth, moist skin. Well, that rules out amphibians for alligator because alligators are covered in scales. So it's not smooth, moist skin. Amphibians are cold-blooded, like the alligator is cold-blooded. But here's another big difference. Alligators have eggs that they laid on land, whereas amphibians lay their eggs in water. Okay, so it's definitely not amphibians. What about birds? Well, alligators aren't covered in feathers, so there goes that. They also don't have wings, so I'm going to go ahead and rule out birds. What about fish? Fish have scales. Alligators have scales. Fish use gills and have fins. Oh, alligator has lungs and legs. Okay, so a few of them were the same, but an alligator is not a fish. What about a mammal? Well, mammals are covered in fur. They produce milk. They have many appendages, and they give birth to live young. Okay, alligators definitely not covered in hair. They do have legs and tails, sort of those many appendages. But again, mammals do not lay eggs. They give birth, whereas this alligator has babies that hatch from eggs, so it is not a mammal. Which takes us to our last grouping, reptile. Okay, so reptiles are covered in scales. They generally have 4 legs. They lay eggs on land, and they're cold-blooded. Let's check. Cold-blooded, check. Scales, check. Have 4 legs, check. Babies hatch from eggs. So there we go. I know that the alligator now is a reptile because it matches all of the characteristics of the reptile category. So I'm going to go ahead and put alligator in the reptile category. I can hit the enter key or return, and that gives me a space for another reptile. Now I'm going to continue that process for the remaining organisms. Some of them will be easier than others. Some of them might be a little tricky. The important thing is check those characteristics, and you're trying to match up all the characteristics ideally. There are some curveballs. Some of the animals will have most of the characteristics, and you're going to have to give it your best guess. All right, that being said, I organize all the organisms, the vertebrates, into their 5 categories, and then I'm going to answer the reflection questions. Most students have trouble answering these questions, so it bears explaining a bit. First one says, using your groupings from this activity and your notes on the different animal groups, which group of animals seems to have the most complex characteristics as a group? Now, what that means is when you look at the group of organisms, amphibians, birds, fish, mammals, and reptiles, are the organisms in those groups, are they mostly the same? Or does the group have many different characteristics? Is there a group that has more complexity to the characteristics within that group? We tend to think that animals with very simple characteristics or characteristics that are the same among most of the species within that group are not as complex as organisms with more complex characteristics. Now, we're going to get into this a lot more as we go through this evolution unit, but this is a great time to start thinking about which of these 5 groups seems the most complex and probably evolved later, and which ones are the least complex and probably evolved first, which is actually what question 3 is. When you look at those organisms, I want you thinking, which group do you think evolved first? What was the first group of vertebrates? They didn't all come out at the same time. One group evolved first, and from that group, other groups evolved. And in what order do you think that happened? Again, it is totally okay to take a guess here. Right now, we're just gathering evidence to be able to answer this question later on. So step 3 is to predict the order of vertebrates, so the first group to evolve, down to the last group to evolve. And then step 4, we would like to see your reasoning. Why did you pick the first group that evolved, and why did you pick the last one? As always, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. We are a phone call, a text, or an email away. Good luck.